Chapter 6. Holy Communion. Section 1. What is received at the Holy Table. Holy Communion is not an exercise as distinct from Holy Mass, and it is only by an act of toleration that the Church permits one to communicate apart from the Holy Sacrifice. While the flesh of the divine victim is still on the altar, and after it has been offered to God as the living expression of religious duty, the priest distributes it. He is bound to feed upon it himself, then he gives it to the faithful. In the primitive Church, all came to take part in the Feast of the Lamb. In our days, all who attend do not draw near, but all are invited, and many are led on by holy desires to accept the invitation. Holy Communion, then, is the natural consummation of the sacrifice of the Mass. Therein the flesh of Christ is received as food. The priest and the faithful partake of it as the bread of the soul. My flesh, says Jesus, is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. Except you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, and drink his blood, you shall not have life in you. He that eateth my flesh, and drinketh my blood, hath everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. This is the bread that came down from heaven. He that eateth this bread shall live forever. John chapter 6, verses 50 through 59. These words of the Gospel show us clearly what to look for in the Holy Eucharist. We communicate neither to experience overpowering sweetness, nor exactly to receive the divine visit, but in order to eat the bread that giveth life. This heavenly bread repairs loss, renews strength, fits us for work, and arms us for the fight. Certainly, it gives joy and fills us with the ineffable presence of God. But above all, it is bread, and the place where we partake of it is called the Holy Table. Thus understood, Holy Communion is manifested to us in its necessity and its effects. He who does not eat this bread will die sooner or later, and the life of God will perish in his soul. But before dying out for want of nourishment, this life, after becoming weakened and powerless to defend itself, will fall under the blows of enemies who harass it unceasingly within and without. Hence the necessity for this divine manna. The Christian has no right to go without it. Besides, what does he not gain in disposition and moral character from this divine food? In proportion as he assimilates the substance of it, he becomes more vigorous, more capable of resistance, more ardent, more active, and more persevering. For strength and animation will have energized his whole being. Compare souls who communicate with those who do not. Follow both classes in the practice of the moral life. We may be quite sure that observation will not give the lie to the promises made by Christ to those who receive the heavenly bread. Look where to find those who control the baser passions, those at any rate who never admit defeat by them, those who make daily efforts to attain to a better life, those who give up their time and their lives to the exercise of charity, those who are most scrupulous in the discharge of the duties of their state of life, and those whose conscience is a mentor always heeded because its voice is taken for the very voice of God. Where will you find them, unless it is principally among those who communicate, and whose hearts are strengthened and uplifted by the living bread? The experience of 19 centuries has borne witness to the words of Jesus. He who refuses this bread rejects life, and he who is careless about taking it has only a drooping life, and he who feeds upon it with a holy hunger has a happy and overflowing life. The mere character of Holy Communion shows plainly enough how frequent it ought to be. If it were to us nothing else than the visit of the King of Kings, we might be kept away from it through fear of bringing some hurt to this Supreme Majesty, or from the irksomeness of having to get ready for a royal reception. But it is a question of giving bread to the famished, of supplying nourishment to those who are exhausted with toil, and who need to be equipped for a fresh task. When bread is set before him, the workman has no need to be pressed. He takes it as soon as he is hungry. And this is the rule by which to measure the frequency of your communions. You will consult your needs, both those of your moral life and those of your heart, and next you will consult your desires, not those which might spring from a certain vanity, but those that take their rise in a true love of Christ. Then you will display to your spiritual director the state of your soul, and you will follow the directions he gives you. If he finds you have a real hunger for the Holy Eucharist, and if he observes that this bread nourishes you and develops your moral life, he will not hesitate to throw the gates of the divine banquet wide open for you. Even the direction to communicate every day need not make you puffed up or timid, for you ought not to regard it as a favor or a burden, but merely as a necessity, to eat day by day the bread of life and to benefit by it. Section 2. Preparation for Holy Communion. From the fact that Holy Communion gives us a seat at the Father's table, it does not follow that we may draw near it without respect. You will show the due measure of your respect and love in the preparation that you bestow upon them. This preparation comprises a habitual state of purity of soul, efforts of will to merit the grace of God, and an ardent appeal of the heart at the moment of reception. The Holy Eucharist, as you know, is only given to the living, because it is a bread of life. It has nothing to do with the dead. If there were some grave sin on your conscience, do not go to the Holy Table. Thus, to take the flesh and blood of Christ would be, in the words of St. Paul, to eat and drink judgment to yourself. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 29. That is to say, it would be to your condemnation. Let this sin, which was that of Judas, never be yours. It were better to undergo any sort of shame than to incur the curse of such a sacrilege. You must then be in a state of grace when you communicate. But for the pious soul this will be too little. Not only will mortal sin not reign in you, venial sin itself will not hold any power over you. Doubtless you cannot avoid all faults, so great is our fragility. But at least you will not love any of them, and you will deplore them all with sincerity of heart. But as soon as you can say to God, "Lord, Thou knowest that I love Thee," John chapter 21, verse 17, and as soon as you can say it with truth, be at peace. You will not be the slave of any sin, and you will have that inner purity that finds favor in the eyes of God. Thus clad in the wedding garment, you can often go into the Lamb's feast. Take care, however, to prepare for the bridegroom gifts to delight him. I mean a sheaf of merits gathered by your endeavors. Or better still, let us borrow from the table and the bread the lesson taught by their symbols. Remember what the Apostle wrote, "If any man will not work, neither let him eat." 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10. The bread, then, is there for him who has earned it. Further, the idler does not hunger for sustenance. The worker alone, in spending his life, gives birth to the keen desire for its renewal. Would you too earn your Eucharistic bread? Work. Would you awaken in your soul an appetite for the heavenly bread? Again, work. Now, the work of the soul is goodness. Therefore, strive today to overcome temptation, to triumph over curiosity and ill humor, to spread around you the joy that shines through kindness, to fulfill with regularity and perfection all the duties of your state of life, and then tomorrow you will go without fear to the holy table, because you will have earned your bread. You will even feel a hearty appetite for the heavenly manna, because you will have trained your life beforehand. When the hour for communion has come, remain in the greatest tranquillity and be full of simple confidence, as befits a son in his Father's house. Follow the Mass with devotion, uniting in the acts and prayers of the priest, and thinking what the Church has set down to prepare the priest to communicate is also an excellent preparation for the believer. Nevertheless, you may have recourse to the religious forms contained in books of devotion, but on condition that you do not look for sensuous satisfaction in them, for God does not give Himself to your senses, but to your faith. And this is exactly why you will begin with an act of faith in the real presence of Jesus living under the appearance of bread, in order to feed you with His flesh. And then, looking through your conscience, you will pray God to blot out the last traces of sin, and you will use the humble words of the centurion, "Lord, I am not worthy that Thou shouldst enter under my roof, but only say the word, and thy servant shall be healed." Matthew chapter 8, verse 8. You will then call for Him with all the ardor of your desires, and you will give yourself up to all the inspirations of divine love. Your prayer, repeated 100 times, will be, "Come, Lord Jesus, come, be the bread of my life, the peace of my senses, the light of my mind, the strength of my will, the joy of my heart, be all mine." Section 3. Thanksgiving after Holy Communion. You will not be one of the ungrateful poor, who as soon as they have received bread, turn away from their benefactor, and instead of blessing the hand that has loaded them with bounty, rather murmur at having received too little. To be thankful, you need only follow the good impulse of your heart. But your faith, too, will incline you to be thankful, by reminding you of the value and absolute gratuitousness of the gift which has been committed to you. Your thanksgiving will be divided into 2 parts. You will begin it before leaving the church, and you will follow it up throughout the day. Unless urgent business calls you to go out, do not leave the church until you have spent a quarter of an hour in giving thanks to God. These few minutes are indeed all too short for pouring out the feelings of your heart, but if they are faithfully observed, they will be a pledge of your gratitude. During these precious moments, the happiest of your life, do not labor to extract any extraordinary thoughts from your mind, but rather open your heart and let it take its course. If it needs arousing by some form of prayer, take a book to stir it up, but as soon as the flame is kindled, let it alone. It will adore by means of an act of faith the God who has given Himself to it. It will thank Him for coming thus under the form of bread to restore its life. It will set forth before Him the needs of the soul, the needs of those whom it loves, and the needs, above all, of those whom it mourns. It will offer Him all that it is and all that it has, its failings that He may mend them, its weaknesses that He may supply them, and its powers that He may use them to the glory of His Father. And it will conclude with a steadfast promise of becoming better by checking such and such faults, or by practicing such and such acts of virtue. However recollected and generous a soul may be during this quarter of an hour, it has not done enough to discharge its debt, and it carries away with it, when it leaves, the memory of the benefits received, and it proposes to prolong its thanksgiving during the hours and days following. Reflecting that it is a living bread that was consumed at the altar, the soul concludes that it must assimilate this food and show itself stronger in moral action. And as it has noticed that the Holy Eucharist is often spoken against and despised by the world, because certain pious people have exhibited to the world lives that the Holy Eucharist has not made better, it wishes its conduct to be a public reparation for the hurt done to God, and the living preaching of the excellence hidden in the Holy Eucharist. And this is why such an one, returning to his family or his business, gives open testimony by his life that one who is great and holy dwells and acts within him. This high being, who by Holy Communion indwells him, is revealed by his calmness in action, his gentleness in word, his amiability of manner, his strength in enterprise, his unselfishness in service, and by his strict fidelity to all the duties of his state of life. If a man is thus to rise above himself, if the steadfastness of his virtue is to prove that a superhuman power possesses him, he must give himself up uninterruptedly to keeping himself in dependence upon Him whom he has received in Holy Communion, conforming to His thoughts and submitting to His influence, and in a word, borrowing His life. And this constant endeavor becomes his living act of thanksgiving. Chapter 7. The Sacrament of Penance. Section 1. The benefits of the Sacrament of Penance. The Holy Eucharist is the most divine of the sacraments. Penance is the most human. God is all in the Holy Eucharist. In it He gives Himself by means of the flesh and blood of Christ. Man has only to lay himself open and to lend himself to His mighty influence. In penance, man plays a greater part. It is by the united activity of the confessor and the penitent that God works the pardon of sins. While grace comes complete in itself from the Eucharist, man collaborates with God to obtain it in penance. God alone, indeed, is the author of forgiveness, but He does not grant it without the moral effort of man. See indeed how the sinner works his conscience. He interrogates it by self-examination, and pushes his inquiry into the most secret depths. Then he makes a faithful avowal of the faults of which he feels that he is guilty, humiliating himself in his own heart not less than in the presence of his confessor. He disturbs himself with repentance, and bows his head beneath the hand that gives him absolution. Lastly, he binds himself to an expiation whereby he mingles the drops of his own blood with the flow of the redeeming blood of Christ. The sacrament will not take place nor produce its effect unless the sinner does all this work. The work is all the more laborious because it must move the soul to its very depths. Superficial feelings would not touch the heart of God, because they would not break the heart of man. They are only effectual on condition that they are sincere, and go down to the roots of our inmost being. Thus the most hidden and shameful faults must be disclosed, and the self-accusation must be entire and without dissimulation. Regret must be universal so far as the faculties of the soul are concerned, as well as regards the sins that are deplored, and the satisfaction made cannot be reduced to an empty formality, it must really strike and correct the sinner. Sincerity then stirs the whole man. It turns his being upside down like a field that is dug up. And for fear lest the sinner be faint-hearted or impotent in thus mending his own heart, he is officially helped in the work by his confessor. Even a priest cannot administer the sacrament of penance to himself. Whoever wishes for the pardon of his faults can only obtain it in ordinary circumstances with the help of God's minister. For this reason the sacrament has its human side. This requirement, far from being a burden, is a consolation. It is therefore in mercy, and not from hardness, that Christ has ordained that in the sacrament of penance the Christian shall be bound to address himself to a judge, a pastor, and a physician, for his confessor is all of these to him. As soon as someone is to hear you, what care do you not apply to the examination of your conscience? What definiteness do you not use in your acknowledgments? As soon as you have before you a man who exhorts you in God's name, what a powerful action will it not have over your faith, your mind, and your will? As soon as you have to do with a man who visibly lifts up his hand with the divine power of giving you absolution, what a deep feeling will you not experience of peace recovered and innocence restored? Take away the man, take away this living representative of God. What vagueness follows in self-examination? What slackness in searching out your faults? What uncertainty in the forgiveness? How superficial the repentance! You cannot then thank God enough for making confession the necessary means of your moral restoration. When the sacrament has been once conferred, the priest has not yet completed his mission so far as you are concerned. When he has purified your soul and blotted out your sins by absolution, he opens to you, by means of direction, the way to a better life. He has repaired the past. He is to prepare for the future. By the enlightenment he gives you, both as to the ideal to follow and as to the spiritual weaknesses that threaten to bar your progress, he will tell you what faults to avoid, what virtues to acquire, and what efforts you must make inwardly and personally in order to increase within you the Christian life. By the impulses that he will impart to your will, he will set it to pray or to work. He will sustain it against inconstancy and prevent it from all kinds of discouragement. This sacred tribunal is then, in all respects, beneficent. The guilty, if he is sincere, leaves it in peace and encouraged. He has found peace because he has unburdened his heart of the weight of his sins, and because he feels by faith the grace of forgiveness descend upon his soul. And at the same time as God was breaking off his chains of sin and setting him free, the compassionate hand of a Father was dressing his wounds and relieving his sufferings. Nothing in our life gives a happier sense of peace than this testimony of a conscience that has regained its self-esteem and the friendship of God. And to this tranquillity strength is added. For by the grace of the sacrament, and with the vigorous influence of the confessor, the penitent receives new light as to his duties, more fervent desires in his heart, fresh energy of soul, and he returns to his moral endeavor with more resolution and courage, and with a greater capacity for perseverance. His fervency may go off, and his will give way again. But what a gain it is to get possession of oneself and to raise oneself once more. Besides, he can again have recourse to the same source of regeneration. Section 2. The practice of confession. A sacrament which is so rich in divine gifts, and in which man's work plays so large a part, must not be treated lightly, but requires the most serious attention in practice. As we are only speaking now to Christians who use confession, We shall only give such counsels as are calculated to enable them to get some real advantage from it. If you are free to choose your confessor, you will preferably select one whose piety guarantees you of coming into close touch with God, whose knowledge will enable him to mark out for you most clearly the path of perfection, and whose firmness will secure the most constant support for your weakness. He must not be antipathetic to you, for fear lest your soul should feel any want of freedom in opening itself to him. But neither must he be so familiar with you that your respect is thereby in any degree diminished, or that he may be to you rather a man than a minister of God. No confession should be a link to bind you to the personality of your confessor. And from time to time it will be a good thing for you to receive the counsels of another, and you may even change him altogether, not indeed out of lightness, or from fear of too powerful a direction, but for good reasons, such as feeling either too embarrassed or too much at ease with him. A pious person who is sound in soul, that is to say, who is neither tormented with scruples nor a victim of grave failings, will usually go to confession once a fortnight. This seems to be the most suitable period, either so that the influence of the sacrament may not die out, or else to avoid the creeping in of a sense of routine. But no rule is obligatory, and in this matter all depends upon the personal needs of each soul. The time taken by a confession is usually from 5 to 10 minutes. Just as haste is but little fitting for the sacrament, so are habitual prolongations of the time baneful to it. Confession is a definite work to be gone through. Take enough time to make each act in it with the gravity that becomes it, but take care that such a grave step does not degenerate into a conversation that might be dangerous. The scrupulous, too, must be led to say what has to be said briskly, for lengthened talk can only increase their malady. A well-conducted self-examination will clearly determine the matter of self-accusation. Let it be quick enough not to be painful nor weakening to the conscience. If grave sins have to be dealt with, a pious person perceives them at once, as it were, on the surface of the soul, so deeply has the trace of them been embedded in it. But thanks be to God, mortal sins will be rare, so that in such an one, as a rule, venial faults alone will be in question. But if it be remembered that venial sins are all pardoned as soon as they are regretted, one infers that it is far less important to discover them than to excite in oneself contrition that shall exclude none of them. Therefore, instead of pulverizing one's conscience and passing it through the crucible of a minute and tiring examination, the penitent should set himself to seize upon his most characteristic, voluntary, and spiritually hurtful faults, which it is urgent that he should indicate to his confessor in order the better to fight against them. As soon as these few sins have been well noted, the time of preparation should be used to excite in oneself feelings of contrition. And as contrition is primarily a gift of God, and then an act of man's heart, it arises and grows in the soul under the twofold influence of prayer that asks for it, and of the effort to express it. The accusation of one's sins should be frank and simple. Frank, that is to say, without any dissembling, dissimulating nothing that might enlighten the confessor, giving as certain what is certain, and as doubtful what is doubtful. Simple, that is to say, neither complicated with stories and circumstances that are of no concern to the confessor, nor clouded with repetitions or reservations which show that the penitent is not very sure of his ground. Confine yourself to a small number of sins which are clearly distinguished, and real ones, and sincerely regretted. long lists of faults set forth in the same hackneyed terms, and without any face-to-face reality in them, and without any contrition definitely brought to bear upon some one sin, are the bane of confessions. When once the act of contrition has been piously said under the absolution of the confessor, there still remains something to be done to give the sacrament all its completeness. There is satisfaction. The penances today given by the priest are indeed very light, whether they be prayers or mortifications, but they have the same meaning as the long and painful penances assigned to penitents by the early Church, whether it be for the expiation of sins committed, or to protect the penitent from fresh falls. In this spirit, and after having done what the priest bids, pious persons will prescribe prayers and acts of sacrifice for themselves, in order to punish themselves for the past, and to make them stronger for the future. Thus, the sacrament of penance is fulfilled by the practice of acts of virtue. Section 3. Spiritual direction. To the sacrament of penance is added, as a kind of supplement, the practice of spiritual direction. It is indeed the confessor himself who is usually the spiritual director, and direction, if it is to be usefully carried out, presupposes as full an opening of the heart as confession itself. Cases may occur in which the spiritual director in whom we confide is not available, and we shall therefore receive direction from one who is not our confessor. A pious person rarely makes progress in perfection if he does not make use of direction. It is not that he will surrender his liberty and management of himself into the hands of his director, because such an abdication would be the abandonment of all progress. On the contrary, he will only make use of his director to enlarge the scope of his personality, and in order to get a better hold upon himself. He has recourse to a director for 4 ends in chief. He looks to him first for the learning of the teacher, for thanks to the enlightenment he gets from it, he can better examine his conscience and discern the spirit with which he is animated, and obtain a clearer and wider view of the road that leads to God. And he learns from it how to wield his spiritual weapons, develops his interior faculties, and applies them with skill to the acquisition of virtue. He finds in the director an awakener of the soul, and one who supplies the stimulus it requires if it is to be kept from lethargy. Without the impetus supplied by direction, he would soon grow weary with the length of the road, so great is the distance between the clear vision of what is right and the full realization of the best intentions. In the moral life, periodical encouragement is a resource of infinite value. When circumstances are difficult, or great responsibilities have to be faced, the director becomes the prudent counselor whose wise advice suggests sound decisions. Then the entire confidence which is placed in his words gives firmness in the midst of embarrassments, and drives away the cruel anguish arising from uncertainty. Finally, let it be added that he is a father and a consoler in sadness and affliction. The hours of suffering are doubly dangerous. The heart's sore wounds give sharp pain, and the strength of the soul melts away in discouragement. Then it is the proper work of the director to pour upon the wounds a sweet balm to relieve their smarting pangs, and to sustain the energy of the will under the violent assaults of trial. Thanks to him, hope survives in the afflicted soul, and action is again made to spring from the broken heart. Direction, however, is only blessed by God, and only produces these consoling effects when it conforms to the rules suggested by Christian prudence, whether we consider the director or the directed. In the director it presumes supernatural enlightenment, knowledge, devotion, and discretion. A supernatural spirit keeps in view solely the glory of God and the good of the soul. Knowledge maintains the director in the right paths, and preserves him from eccentricities and novelties. Devotion makes him ready to sacrifice himself for souls without listening to thoughts of idleness or of self-interest. Lastly, discretion makes him respect the individuality of his penitent as a sacred treasure house. There are very indiscreet directors who go too far, and use a sort of violence in penetrating into the lives of those whom they direct, and who harass them with importunate questions or load them with exacting requirements. Let them remember that so far as the soul is concerned, they are not warders who have to imprison them in their own caprices, but guides who have to free them from their bonds and to encourage them to walk alone. They are not to such an extent the masters of people's souls as to be able to prevent them from seeking counsel elsewhere, and they ought to use no less circumspection to check any intimacy which might cause their direction to miss the way and might make it dangerous. Those who seek guidance should give full confidence to their director, but without abandoning their own individuality. Their confidence looks to their director for supernatural illumination, to enlighten them as to the path of duty, and for strength to walk in it. It implies docility of spirit and heart as to counsels or moral impulses imparted by the representative of God. But it is important that the personality of the penitent should remain intact. Because a soul seeks direction, it does not become like a senseless ball struck by a tennis player, but instead of being passive and of moving mechanically, it has the sense of acting on its own initiative and on its own responsibility, and it walks with a free step and with deliberation in the way of action marked out by the director. It is only on this condition that it can acquire any merit, since then its acts become its own, and it develops its own faculties, since it is its own activity that comes into play. Let there be no fear that the personality of the penitent may offer some hindrance to obedience. On the contrary, obedience gets its dignity and its high moral value from the fact that it puts itself on the side of authority with a deliberate will and with intentional submission. Obedience, moreover, cannot extend to everything. There are a number of acts which must be performed daily on one's own personal initiative. The true moral temper, therefore, is composed of personal initiative based on the spirit of obedience. Chapter 8. Instructions and Reading. Section 1. Their necessity. God does not exhaust His power of communicating with man in the sacraments. By penance and by the Holy Eucharist, He pours floods of light into the hearts of Christians. But the way in which they enter into the heart is as mysterious as is their action. His graces reach us by other channels as well. They certainly are less rich, but they are more within the reach of our senses, and their influence is more easily studied. These are instructions and readings. What God wishes to say to us when we are praying, in order to enlighten our minds and to touch our hearts, this He wills to impart to us by the spoken or written word. Before we speak to Him in prayer, He wishes us to listen to Him in our reading. This disposition of providence is moreover in accord with the plan followed by God in all His works. In the valleys there is no spring which is so abundant as not to run dry if the heights from which it flows are long without rain. Nor is there in the plains any grass, however green, that will not dry up and die if the ground in which its roots are set is not frequently watered by dew from heaven, or by artificial irrigation. To all that lives, some outward supply is necessary, and if left to itself, the most vigorous of germs would not fructify. And thus it is with the things of the Spirit, and more particularly with the life of piety. No doubt this life has its origin within, but its activity only develops under the impulse that comes from without. In order that this mystical plant may live and grow, it is indispensable that the heavenly rain should fall upon the heights of the soul and fructify all its faculties. And whilst the sacraments will increase the strength of its inner vitality, instructions and reading will nourish the mind and the heart with thoughts and feelings that will enrich it from without. So far is meditation from being able to make up for this, that it can itself only be maintained by borrowing from men and books. If by the written or spoken word a powerful thought enters into the soul, immediately all the faculties awaken and begin to act. The mind considers it in its different aspects, the heart uses it to renew its feelings, the imagination gives it a sensible shape, and the whole being hastens to receive from it sustenance and greater vigor. But soon, like a food from which the digestion has extracted all the nourishment, this thought is without any remaining goodness in it, and the word that enshrined it becomes sterile. A new element must be implanted in the soul, or else its activity will begin to slumber, and if the vacuum remains, it slowly wastes away by the very fact of disuse. All lives that are left to themselves inevitably begin to sink. And so men of prayer take great care not only to be recollected, but also to surround themselves with a rich atmosphere of good thoughts and pious feelings, which will prevent them from falling into aridity. Their experience teaches them that piety withers like a plant in dry ground, as soon as reading and instruction cease to make the beneficent stream of thought and feeling flow through their hearts. These laws of the interior life are only too well verified by observations which can be made at every step. You are surprised that amongst the people the taste for the practices of religion falls away so quickly after their first communion, and that the faith itself is so soon shaken or uprooted among them. But how can it be otherwise? These folks, as soon as they are 12 years old, never read any religious book and hear no instructions, or else if they do hear them, for various reasons for which they are not responsible, the instructions have no hold upon them. From a religious point of view, their soul is like a desert where there is neither seed nor water. What is there to ponder at if life perishes, and if it is so hard to make it afterwards revive in their case? There often may be seen young folks who until they were 18 years of age have grown up in piety in zealous boarding schools. On returning to their families, they gradually lose their pious habits, they grow weary of their exercises, and in proportion as they give up praying, moral effort also gets weaker until it disappears. Do not hasten to blame the convent which has brought them up. While there, they were daily sustained with instructions and reading, and grew like young shoots by the water's edge. And if they are now wasting away, is it not because nothing comes to nourish their first vigor? Engulfed in the whirlpool of worldly excitement, deprived of books and exhortations to piety, increasingly engrossed with worldly thoughts and preoccupations, they undergo a fatal decadence. until they struggle against their new surroundings by putting themselves under their former influences with the greatest fidelity. In the same way, look for no other cause of that spiritual languor, soon followed by dryness and distaste, which besets young priests a few months after leaving the seminary. Their piety was wanting neither in sincerity nor in soundness, so long as it had proper nourishment to sustain it. And if it now begins to wither and is in danger of dying, it is because it no longer receives, either from books or men, the stimulus required for its vitality. It is usual to say to such priests, "Be regular in your daily prayer, and you will be saved." But we should resolutely add, you will only continue your prayer and make it bear fruit if you make a practice of spiritual reading. It is a sovereign remedy. For edifying conversation and encouraging reading, like newly rising sap, stir and make souls young again, and clothe them with verdure for a rich and fruitful harvest. History is full of these revivals of the soul wrought by the powerful action of words of piety. Of all words spoken on earth, none were ever more luminous nor more inspiring than those of Jesus, so that his enemies called him the seducer. Matthew chapter 27, verse 63. And the crowds, enchanted by them, followed him into the wilderness and cried, "Never did man speak like this man." John chapter 7, verse 46. The happy disciples of Emmaus, after talking with him by the way, could well say, "Was not our heart burning within us whilst he spoke in the way?" Luke chapter 24, verse 31. And he communicated this persuasive power to his apostles. St. Paul moved King Agrippa. "In a little," said the king, "thou persuadest me to become a Christian." Acts chapter 26, verse 28. Even in our own days, the burning and supernatural speech of our missionaries exerts an influence over the multitude that renews their faith and moral generosity. Who of us has not felt his heart touched by an utterance full of the Spirit of God? Whether it be spoken from the pulpit, or whether it be said in private, it has the power, if it be divinely inspired, of reviving the mind and heart. Books, too, though to a lesser extent, have the power of awakening souls, and of giving richness to their life. From time immemorial, reading has been the sustenance of the religious, and has strengthened their Christian temper. It was for believers who had never heard Christ and yet desired to feed upon His words day by day that the Gospels were written. Since then, how many saints in solitude, how many apostolic men, how many persons engaged in worldly affairs have maintained themselves and made progress in the Christian spirit by familiarity with these divine pages. The same breath of Jesus Christ inspires the lives of the saints as well as their spiritual writings. The books which narrate their history or which contain their writings are inexhaustible springs from which souls athirst for progress may drink deep of divine gifts. It is in reading that communities find holy thoughts, which enable souls to practice recollection and safeguard silence, as well as those feelings of compunction that keep sin at a distance and give a moral impetus. If communities were deprived of books and instructions, immediately their gravity would be dissipated, and disorder would come in, and the rule of God would be cast aside. In the same way, if you leave a pious person without his daily spiritual reading, you will soon have to deplore a falling off in his religious state. Therefore, let this practice be considered indispensable by anyone who wishes to live a holy life. Section 2. How to make use of men and books. If you are really convinced that it is necessary to receive the Word of God from without, in order that your interior life may be sustained and grow, you will seek for it wherever God offers it to you, whether on human lips or in the pages of books. It is most alive when it springs forth, warm and communicative, from the hearts of pious men who draw their feelings and thoughts from God. But there are only a few who so live upon the love of God that their entire individuality is a sermon. Yet they are to be found. If God grants you the singular grace of coming across such as these, you will recognize them by this sign, that their words will seem to you as some warm breath of springtime, which brings forth in you the buds of holy desires. Allow yourself, then, to be influenced by their beneficent action. If they preach, go to hear their instructions. If they are spiritual directors, take their advice. Draw near every source that emits rays of life. Often, alas, you will hear things said which are not at all above the ordinary, but listen to them nevertheless, because of the good seed that you may perhaps gather from them. Instead of criticizing them, it is better for you to seek to obtain from them such profit as you can. Those who have the gift of awakening souls are so few and far between, and usually so difficult to get at, that you will probably be reduced to listening to the voice of God chiefly in books. If books are colder, they have the advantage of being inseparable companions. They accompany us into the deepest solitudes, and they reach us, filled as they are with the spirit of the eminent men who have written them under the inspiration of God. Hold them as your dearest friends, and know that it is God Himself who speaks to you from their pages. You will not spend a single day without reading something. However busy you may be, do not allow yourself to go without it any more than you would without your meals or your prayers. Your soul needs this sustenance. It will not be able to pray unless the Word of God concentrates and enlightens and fires it. Outside of communities, there are but few who can give half an hour to this daily reading. If you only set apart a quarter of an hour, or even less, you would not fail to draw much profit from this meeting with God and listening to His voice. You will preferably choose the evening for your reading, when your business is over and you can enjoy silence and repose. The more you feel moral lassitude and disillusionment, the more empty your heart is of human companionship, the more need you will have of taking refuge in God and of experiencing His fatherly kindness. Then it is sweet to lay oneself open in His pure illumination, and to renew one's life in His wholesome atmosphere. While you are asleep, the seeds implanted in your soul in the evening will germinate freely. Working inwardly and fruitfully, though all unconsciously, thoughts of wisdom and instincts of goodness will gain the upper hand, and next morning you will resume the labor of life with a heart full of generosity and kindliness. And in order that your reading may be thus beneficial, you will choose books that are less intellectual than spiritual, and that appeal rather to your soul than to your mind. Works of the intellect only may be learned, but they are lacking in life. On the other hand, books that come entirely from the soul are certainly not wanting in what can illumine the intelligence, but they possess the incomparable gift of awakening or of arousing life by kindling the heart. Let us add that they should be written under the influence of religion. Besides, it is on this condition that they act upon the very depths of the soul. Amongst all books, you will particularly be devoted to the Holy Scriptures, and especially to the Gospels. There you have the true Word of God, and it comes to you by the apostles and the prophets, or from Jesus Christ Himself. Let the Gospel hold the first place in your library. I should like to see no day pass in which you did not draw near in spirit to this glowing centre of your Master's words. After the sacred writings, there is nothing more divine or more wholesome than the Imitation of Christ. This book shows no trace of any time or nation, nor of any particular individual, just as it gives no signature. It is the sublime and simple conversation of the good God with suffering humanity. Until the end of the ages, in all climates and under all forms of civilization, the human soul, whether educated or not, will feel that these pages contain the cry of its agonized heart and the pitiful reply of its God. Make use, then, of the Imitation. In reading it, you will ever raise the level of your soul from a religious point of view. Have also by you the Introduction to a Devout Life of St. Francis of Sales. Piety has never been taught with more grace, rightness, and good sense. This book, too, is one of those that never grow old, because it answers to the deepest aspirations of the human heart. And to this, the spiritual combat of which St. Francis of Sales himself made so much, and you will have the 4 books, familiarity with which is indispensable to every one who aims at piety. The books afterwards to be made use of may be divided into 3 classes: the Lives of the Saints, which show us sanctity in practice, and thus persuade us that it is within the reach of human strength, and lead us on by example to become better. Treatises on spiritual subjects, which were so numerous and so much read in the 16th and 17th centuries, but are so much fewer and weaker in our own days, and of which the best appreciated are those of Rodriguez, Faber, and Gay. And lastly, books of devotion, such as the various booklets of St. Alphonsus, which give instruction and prayers for various exercises. Whatever books you read, do not store them in your memory, or make use of them as if it were for some learned work. Inhale and live in the pure, warm air of their pages. Have recourse to them, not to obtain knowledge, but to get from them a more intense and a higher life. Keep your soul under their influence, like some newly turned ground beneath the hand of the sower or the rain of heaven. Without making any effort, and with nothing but your inward silence, you will become enriched and made fruitful. You will leave off different from what you were when you began. This change of condition is the true result to aim at in the religious use of books or men. Chapter 9. Examination of Conscience. Section 1. Its place in the life of piety. The immediate aim of piety is to put man in close intimacy with God, for by faith it brings forth God from the shadows of mystery and makes Him perceptible to the heart. By love it embraces Him and takes possession of Him, and by prayer it becomes attached to Him and drinks in His life, like the babe at its mother's breast. This intimacy produces joy and peace, together with a feeling of confidence and strength. But enjoyment, however pure it may be, is not the ultimate end of piety. God gives Himself under the form of life, not to efface our own personal life, but to raise it up and to make it better. He sanctifies us, less by making sanctuaries of us in which there is the consecration of His presence, than by inspiring us with worthier feelings and nobler actions. It were then to misunderstand the divine purpose and to paralyze the action of the Holy Spirit if in our piety we did not follow after an increase of moral life by means of virtue. He who only seeks enjoyment in his piety is false to God's gifts. God only gives Himself and imparts happiness to us here below in order to help us to live better. And hence piety enjoins those actions which are predisposed by a good moral life. These acts may be reduced to two in chief: the taking knowledge of oneself and the conquest of oneself. The morally good man is he who has made the conquest of himself in the struggle with the 1,000 tyrants who contend with him for the rule over his being. He attains a higher moral elevation in proportion as he escapes outside influences and inner caprice, and as being his own master, he gives himself all the more wholeheartedly to duty. But in order to be one's own master, the first condition is to remain at home within one's own heart. Nothing arouses a man more to undertake the government of his life than a frequent examination of conscience, a strict watch upon the movements of his mind and heart, and a faithful taking stock of the value of his acts and of their bearing. This is exactly the end of the examination of conscience. This is what marks its place and signalizes its high importance in the life of piety. You are not really pious unless you obtain from God the gift of a better life, and you will only live a good life on condition of dwelling within yourself and attending to the inner motions of the soul. But you will only be at home in your own heart if your examination of conscience frequently causes you to come back to it. Every tradesman who has the prosperity of his house at heart remains faithfully at his place of business. He receives the goods himself, he takes care of their safety and checks their sale. He keeps his books accurately and often compares his cash balance with his accounts. His vigilance eliminates the causes of loss and adds to the number of opportunities for making a profit. Whilst ruin enters surreptitiously into the dwelling of the careless man who neglects his affairs, fortune awaits him whose careful eye provides for everything. It is the same in the sphere of morality. Self-examination is the safeguard in it for the most sacred interests of the soul. It is indeed by the examination of his conscience that a man enters into his own heart. There he is the witness of the feelings that arise, of the passions which disturb him, and of the failings that bring humiliation upon him. He sees the good aspirations that come to grief, and the bad impulses that get the upper hand. And aware of his wretchedness and also of his strength, he knows both what to dread and what he may hope for. And this knowledge agitates and arouses him, and makes him form good resolutions. For however low he may have fallen, there is still within him a deep instinct which is inherent in his nature, and which protests against anything what is wrong. It is indeed an echo of the voice of God that reverberates in a man's conscience when he is overtaken with remorse at the sight of the sins that he has committed, or of the failings into which he has fallen. If so many people daze themselves with dissipation in order not to hear such reproaches as these, and if they flee from themselves in order not to perceive the stains in their own hearts, it is because they wish to evade the painful effort of reaction that a sight of their wretchedness would stimulate in their souls. Thus act those sick people who avoid getting to know their own true condition, in order to spare themselves the anxiety of the medical treatment which a clear knowledge of their danger would force them to undergo. The examination of conscience is not in itself a remedy for the ills of the soul, but it effectively invites the soul to take the remedy that will cure it. Section 2. The use of the examination of conscience. The most skillful masters of the spiritual life, and especially St. Ignatius Loyola, considering piety as a means of moral progress, have placed the examination of conscience among the most essential of the exercises of the pious life. In cases of sickness and of overwhelming occupation, they allow the putting on one side of vocal prayer, and even of interior prayer, but they ask that the examination of conscience should never be omitted. So sure are they that the examination of conscience can make good for all the rest, and that nothing else can make up for the want of it. Some pious people who have a habit of recollection and are attentive to the inner motions of their hearts easily dispense with fixed hours of examination and with definite subject matter for it. They are wrong and deprive themselves of a great source of aid. For this general view of their conscience, without any definite point, is utterly wanting in moral effectiveness. In this vague cognizance that they take of themselves, they do not get an idea of what they are wanting in, and they do not derive from this hazy view of themselves a victorious impulse towards what is good. Anyone who looks to piety for the moral strength to lead a better life should therefore settle for himself every day a time to be set apart for the examination of his conscience. It will be at any rate in the evening, at the hour of prayer with which the day closes, and in communities which are fervent, they add to this the recollection at midday. Examination of conscience is only real and brings forth fruit on condition of having a definite object. To enter into one's own house is well, but to be satisfied with going round it with a hasty glance is to run the risk of seeing nothing in it. To find out what is out of order, it is necessary to scour a few corners every day, sometimes one and sometimes another. How many houses, to all appearance well kept, reveal serious shortcomings if some one part of them is scanned with close and continued observation? In an examination of conscience, the eyes of the soul will first of all look in the direction of one's dominant fault, for there it is that the chief gaps in the moral life appear. And if some are so far ignorant of themselves as not to know what their dominant failing is, they can either watch their own disposition, of which it is usually the natural product, or else ask their spiritual director, who will quickly perceive in their habitual faults what is their most harmful tendency. This principal tendency, which rules the whole of the life, is outwardly expressed in act and word, but after having aroused complex movements within. Those who are only beginning, and who are so far but little trained to catch and repress their inmost thoughts and feelings, will first of all keep watch over words and acts which afford more tangible material for examination, and over these the will has a greater hold. But with patience, attention will turn by degrees from without to within, and will discover defects to be corrected in their very source, and will suppress them before they have had time to come out into the open. There is then an order to be kept in this moral strategy, the object of which is the conquest of self. If sensualism is a serious check to virtue, it must be the primary objective of our attack. As soon as the flesh has been nearly subdued, the hours of the day must be rescued from being arranged by caprice. For he who is master of his time has acquired a great amount of strength. Then will come the art which St. James declares to be so important and so difficult, of governing one's tongue, so that it shall not trip in uttering hurtful or inconsiderate words, such as offend against charity or good taste. Whatever may be the matter of our self-examination, it must be done under the eyes of God and in utter sincerity of soul. Piety will preside over it, either because it calls for divine enlightenment by prayer, or else because at the end it implores for grace and strength to overcome evil. Straightforwardness, too, has its part to play, both in driving away delusions that might hide the soul's weaknesses from the search, and to prevent dissimulation from closing the lips against making the indispensable avowals. Happy are those who examine themselves straightforwardly, judge themselves strictly, and correct themselves faithfully. They are in the way of salvation. Chapter 10. Spiritual Retreats. Section 1. The advantage of a retreat. The spiritual retreat, during the last 3 centuries, has become an important instrument in the Christian life. Priests and faithful prepare themselves in a retreat for the salient circumstances of their lives. The bishop for his consecration, the clergy for their ordination, the religious for their profession, the young for the choice of their calling, and children for their first communion. In addition to these solemn occasions, retreats have been introduced in the course of the years as they go by, as regular halting places, where after a laborious stage has been passed, we like to take recuperative rest, either at the end of every month, or at least at the end of each year. Sometimes even in fervent communities, a prolonged retreat brings with it the blessing of a second novitiate. If the spiritual retreat has taken such a place in Christian practice, whether amongst the religious or amongst priests, it must be because experience has made them recognize its invaluable advantages. It is because honest souls come forth all renewed from these pious exercises that they have been adopted as the highest means of moral regeneration by all associations of the religious. Bishops have gladly seen the faith and zeal of their priests revived in them. Directors of seminaries during these blessed seasons have witnessed the richest growth of priestly virtues in the hearts of the younger clergy. Superiors of communities perceive that the Divine Spirit always revives religious fervor during the retreat. And lastly, in the world, how many souls which have gone astray have returned to the right path? How many hardened sinners have been transformed? How many sick hearts have been healed, thanks to the holy exercises of a retreat gone through with sincerity? And how can the retreat be otherwise than beneficent, since it procures for the soul which gives itself up to it the contemplation of eternal truths, the prolonged examination of its own conscience, and urgent and overpowering appeals of God's grace? Eternal truths usually hold so small a place in our thoughts. Our attention is fascinated by the objects that surround us, limited to the horizons of earth, and not drawn towards the long vistas of the hereafter. Our ears are filled with the noises of this world, deafened with the clamour of all kinds of interests, and do not listen to the words of God. Now come the hours of the silence and solitude of the retreat. Then let the whole world vanish from before our eyes, and the cries of earth be dumb around us. Immediately light from on high reaches us and draws our soul heavenwards. The voice of God echoes in our conscience, and makes us listen to the divine appeals. The great lesson which we then learn is that of the nothingness and of the worth of life. Life is nothing, so short is it, as compared with eternity which never ends. Life is of infinite worth, nevertheless, if indeed we regard it as a preparation for an eternity of happiness or of damnation. If life be nothing, why should we become attached to it? And why should we be so wanting in patience amidst the sorrows and labours which will so soon come to an end? If life be the short time for the great trial in which each one has to win his place in eternity, what madness it is to waste the hours of it! What a missing of the mark to spend them in doing ill! On the contrary, is it not the highest wisdom to sow while here below, in labour and tears, the rich harvests of eternity? Indeed, how poor seems the earth in itself to him who has his eyes on heaven. But on the other hand, how beautiful is it in the eyes of those who plough the furrow in which the seed of eternal felicity is to spring forth. In the same way, man forgets his own heart when carried away with the rush of his daily business. Everything takes him outside of himself. He knows neither what he does nor what he wants. His soul escapes from his control, and if he is not careful, it may become the victim of terrible and unforeseen occurrences. But if by means of a retreat he gets free from the whirl of business and affairs, if alone and by himself he practices recollection in solitude, then immediately he recovers himself, he enters into his own conscience, and he is able to take account of what he is. For his soul will quite spontaneously reveal itself to him, even to the very depths. He sees what notions haunt his mind and govern his life, and whether they are thoughts of heaven or of earth, whether they are suggested by faith and reason, or by the more tainted sources of the world and the senses. He fathoms his heart, and tries the worth of the affections implanted in it, to see whether they are such as elevate the soul, or such as lower it by bringing it into bondage. He measures the strength of his will, estimates its faults and failings, reckons up its defeats, and compares them with the victories too rarely won. He then knows what is the condition of his soul. If it is in a state of defilement or of sin, he will make an effort to get rid of it. If it is in a state of lukewarmness, he will bring it back to fervor. If it is in a state of loyalty to duty, he will thank God and ask for the grace to be still more sanctified. Lastly, the world is a place in which there blows an icy wind, the cold blasts of which check the springing up of virtues. The most generous lives in the long run experience a fatal falling away from it, unless from time to time they renew their vigor in a warmer atmosphere. This bracing air, in which the moral life regains strength, is found in the retreat, which surrounds the faithful soul with it. There, in fact, reigns divine grace. It is a paradise in which God is the sun, shedding floods of light and warmth. Under the influence of these beams from on high, good desires germinate, ardent prayers have their birth, and generous resolutions ripen and give the promise of a harvest of holy works. After spending several days in the forcing heat of this divine life, man is happily overcome by grace, and leaves the retreat purified, enlightened, resolute, and better equipped. Section 2. Conditions of success of a retreat. The retreat, however, only produces these happy results on certain conditions. It must be begun with confidence, and in it one must give oneself up to the greatest solitude and to great interior activity. Confidence is the first condition of success. Do not say, "I have made so many retreats, and so often they have borne no fruit. What is the use of making any efforts in the one I am about to begin? I shall not be able to persevere any better this time than I have done in the past." This is a hurtful way of reasoning, suggested by spiritual idleness, and its effect is to paralyze the endeavors of a good will. Rather say, "It is true that I have been unfaithful to my good resolutions, and that after the fine impulses of religious fervor I fell back into a spiritless lukewarmness, and perhaps even into sin. At any rate, I have purified my soul, I have made good all its energies, and I performed acts of virtue which will count for heaven. If I could only succeed in rekindling for a time the Christian life in the depths of my soul, if I could only have the joy of finding once more the presence of my God for a few weeks, certainly the result would be well worth the effort. but I have a right to expect something better. This retreat will, perhaps, be the last one in my life. How should I begrudge it at the hour of my death, if I had missed it? Besides, some special grace of God is awaiting me in it. How ungrateful should I be if I were not to respond to it. If I do my part in this work which is about to begin, and in which God goes before me, I shall obtain from it inestimable fruits of life. To God's advances, then, I will answer with unsparing generosity. This good will to which one should stir oneself up at the outset would be barren if one did not immerse one's soul in the deepest solitude, silence so far as the world is concerned, and silence in the soul itself. From the outside let there be neither communications, nor visits, letters, nor speech during the retreat. Let the world be to us as if non-existent. Let God only be present to us, and let us have to do with Him alone so far as the great interests of our life are concerned. Let us be persuaded that all that interrupts this silence from men or things will interfere with the action of God to our very great loss. So far as the soul is concerned, let there be silence too. Let all thoughts of the world be shut out of the mind. Let even the most lawful affections of the heart be dumb. The soul can only give its attention to God when the mind has recovered all its clearness, and the heart all its liberty. This silence, which is so essential to divine action, is not gained in a single day. Distracting voices are only hushed by degrees, and in those souls alone who are determined to effect this beneficent isolation in themselves. But this solitude is not a wilderness in which the soul is able to give itself up to a drowsy idleness. The maker of a retreat only isolates himself in order to be free to be with God, and he only seeks this liberty to apply himself to strenuous toil. He awakens the activity of his mind by converse to which he listens with eagerness, and by deliberately selected readings with which he fills up his valuable time. He sets his heart in motion with earnest prayers, vocal prayers which he multiplies in order to kindle his fervour, mental prayers that bring him into intimate union with God. He arouses his will to make resolutions for a better life, first by a humble confession of sins to the priest, and then by an intelligent preparation of a scheme of life which he draws up, taking account of the extent of his strength and of the needs of his soul. From these retreats, with their silence and activity, the Christian comes forth all illumined with heavenly gifts, all steeped in divine graces, so that his piety, renewed in its source, afterwards manifests itself, as it should, in a holier life. Conclusion. A prayer for the grace of piety. O God, who art unseen, but whom my reason acknowledges to be present to my whole being, and whom my faith makes me feel in my heart. O good God, who wast graciously pleased not only to give me the precious gift of life, but hast taught me how to use it so as to win eternal happiness. O generous God, prodigal of thyself, who by thy grace impartest thine own life to those who pray unto thee, condescend in thy mercy to awaken me to a knowledge of what thou art to me, and of what I should be to thee, so that I may not go through the time of trial on earth with blinded eyes and idle hands. Let me never be enticed away by deceitful vanities, base pleasures, and vain riches, nor by mad ambition, for fear that I should let my thoughts and desires be made captive by the narrow confines of the world. Rather, stamp my whole being with an impress of the love that gives rise to piety, in order that, passing beyond the narrow borders of things visible, I may enter by faith into the pure regions of things invisible, which Thou fillest with Thy majesty and animatest with Thy life. Grant, Lord, that my mind may be enlightened by the contemplation of eternal truths, that my heart may glow with their pure flames on coming into contact with the burning fuel of Thy holy love, and that my will may obtain invincible energy from the infinite stores of Thy omnipotence, and without losing the joys of the intimate union with Thee that comes from prayer, I shall return transfigured to the work which has been given me to do here below. I shall be more attentive to the duties of my state of life, more patient and more kindly with my fellows, more resigned in sorrow and more zealous in forwarding Thy interests, so that the world may learn, O good and dear Master, from my example, not only that Thou loadest with happiness those who love Thee, but above all, that by pious intercourse with Thee, one grows better, that the faithful Christian becomes one of the elect for eternity, in proportion as he is more truly a man while living in time, and that in consequence it is in Thee that we must seek, O my God, the grace to grow and to become useful.